everybody. Welcome to verse-by-verse-BibleTeaching.com. My name is Chris.
And I am Mike. We're here today looking at Galatians chapter 3 today. This is, I think, the fourth or fifth post we've done here in our Galatians study. And we're starting on verse 11 here of Galatians chapter 3. But just by way of review, I want to get everybody up to speed. We looked at, obviously, our first podcast was we looked at our introduction, and then we saw in verse 11 of chapter 1, Paul defends his authority of his gospel. And then that went on up all the way to about, the end of chapter 2. And then in chapter 3, we see Paul starting a new sort of thing that's going to go all the way up to verse 31 of chapter 4. We're going to see Paul defending the message of his gospel. In a doctrinal sense. Paul, for the first 14 verses in chapter 3, he talks about receiving the Spirit and the impartation, of new life by faith rather than by works. So we're going to see the last 3 or 4 things of that here in the first part of our study. Then he's going to move on to a new theme, which goes all the way up to verse 24 in chapter 3, which is the salvation, that salvation is through promise rather than through the law. And we probably won't get quite to 24 today, but we'll get in the various, we'll get close.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I know, I don't know about you, but I definitely have viewed this section of Galatians chapter 3 as really particularly challenging theologically. There's just so much depth going on. He's actually sort of doing this really in-depth study of the Old Testament that Paul, as a Pharisee, would have probably known better than most people. So he had a really good handle on the scriptures, and he's really sort of flexing that biblical muscle in these next few passages. Yeah. So he's kind of fighting these people who are wanting to take the Old Testament and say, hey, we're following the real Old Testament, and Paul's like, all right, kids, sit down here. Let's look at the Old Testament,
Yeah.
So he's kind of using their own sword against them there.
Paul of Tarsus, the Old Testament is my bag.
Right.
Yeah. Let's just jump in here to verse 11, shall we?
Yeah.
But that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God, it is evident. For the just shall live by faith. Now, the just shall live by faith is obviously a very important phrase in that it ties together a great many things that we as Christians both believe and study and just sort of see in the Bible. We can look at this and let's take that phrase, the just shall live by faith. Let's take that apart just a little bit. Well, who are the just? The just are obviously those who have been justified, who are born again, who follow Christ, who have been redeemed by his blood. The just shall live. Well, okay. There appears to be some sort of unilateral command language there. These who are defined as just, they are supposed to do something. Well, what is it? It's live. The way and the how and the why and the what for, everything that they do needs to reflect something in the way that they live, which is sort of my next point here. The just shall live by faith. The way that we are to live is by faith. Now, faith is something that is not always seen. There are many who make analogies to it and about it. I think, Hebrew 11, I believe, makes a very particularly poignant analogy. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, for by it the elders obtained a good report. And then he goes on talking about sort of the hall of faith there. If you will permit me a much less apt analogy, living by faith is like sitting down on a couch you've never been told about. You've been told about, but you don't actually know is there sometimes. Let me give sort of an example. For instance, society says, sleep with as many people of the opposite sex as you can. God says sex is sacred and mystical and should only be done if in a marriage covenant relationship. Society says, follow your heart. God says, I order your steps, follow me. Society says, man's heart is good. God says, man's heart is wicked. Society says, Jesus, well, he's a good teacher, and there are many ways to God, and he's sort of one of them. And God says, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the light. No man comes to the Father except through me. So you see everything trying to push you and saying, in a sense, like, don't sit down on that couch, don't live in that faith, don't live by that faith, those things that you may not be able to easily see. And God is saying, you can trust me, you can sit on this couch, these are the things that you can build your life on, so that when the storms come, nothing blows away. So what you see here is Paul saying exactly that. The just shall live by faith. So sit down on the couch. Chris?
Hey, that was pretty awesome, man. That's some good points there. Yeah, and that phrase, the just shall live by faith, is a quote from the Old Testament that Paul is sort of using. It's from Habakkuk. I'm sure there's probably different ways to say that, but I'm not saying either.
There's only one way. It's Habakkuk.
Let's go to the Jewish pronunciation dictionary.
Okay, go ahead.
Anyway, it's basically something that is used prominently in the New Testament, as you mentioned, in Romans and Hebrews, and here in Galatians, and those three books sort of form a trilogy almost in that sort of breaking down that you mentioned. Who are the just? How shall they live? And then by faith. So, and that's one of the Misslerisms. Every time he runs into one of these, yep, he loves to go off on that one. But anyway, the Old Testament, when it does speak about this in that book that is named a particular name, it contrasts the just in that passage to the proud, and the proud in that passage look to themselves as opposed to God. So it is sort of the just shall live by faith. The Christians shall live by a different way than the world. That they should live by faith. That God knows what He's doing, and what He says is righteous and true. But anyway, Paul here is making another appeal to the Old Testament doctrine of grace through faith, and that it's found in the Old Testament scriptures. Really good quote here by Luther, again, in his great commentary in Galatians here. He says, "The scholastics misconstrue this passage by saying the just shall live by faith. It is a working faith, or a faith formed and performed by charitable works. Their annotation is a forgery. To speak of formed or unformed faith, a sort of double faith, is contrary to Scriptures. If charitable works can form a perfect faith, I am forced to say eventually that charitable deeds constitute the essential factor in the Christian religion. Christ and His benefits would be lost to us." Then also in this verse it says, "But that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God." And here Paul is just repeating and concluding the previous thought in verse 10, which says that verse real quick is, "For as many are of the works of the law are under the curse, for it is written, curses everyone that continueth not in all things which are written in the book of the law to do them." Verse 11 continues, "But that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God." So it's basically, he's concluding the thought that we are utterly hopeless to be right with God by our good deeds, or our comparison to other people, which is something that is so easily done when we look at other people and we're doing good, and we say, well, we must be different than them in that we are doing, more good deeds. But that is what this is refuting. So yeah, that's all I have on that one.
Wow, I did more good deeds. I'm extra saved. I love saying that. That might come up again. Let's see, Galatians chapter 3, verse 12. "And the law is not of faith, but the man that doeth them shall live in them." Obviously, Paul is continuing with his contrast of following the law versus walking by faith. Or I guess in this case it might be more biblically appropriate to say living by faith. The main point here is just that man does and lives within whatever theological and, if you will, spiritual framework he chooses to live within.